Hello everyone, this is Jotto and welcome to episode 100 of the Hearthstone Weekly Show. I've been doing these for 2 years at this point, more or less, and I can't believe I actually got to 100. I did not think I'd get this far. I was surprised when I got to 50, but 100 is a lot. It's a lot of episodes and probably, knowing me, about 60 to 70 hours of videos. But anyway, so for this episode number 100, I decided to do a set comparison between Naxxramas and Blackrock Mountain. Which is the better adventure? Now, I'm going to compare these in a couple of categories. First thing is impact on constructed, impact in arena, which I know less about, but anyway. And thirdly, how they function as an adventure. So bosses and heroics and card distribution and things like that. Now, a lot of this is obviously based on a bit of memory because Naxxramas was released about a year ago at this point, so I've got to kind of remember what the metagame was. I did make some notes, but even then I'm probably going to forget something. And the most played arena format for me was actually GVG. I have played a decent amount of Naxxramas and BRM arena. But if you're a dedicated arena player, you probably know more about it than I do, so just bear with me a little bit. Constructed is generally my specialty, and arena is something I usually just do on the side when I have the gold. So anyway, considering that, we are going to go through the cards from a just highlight basis in terms of constructed. So, let's start with BRM. So if we look at just the cards in general, what actually made an impact? We had Druid of the Flame, Quick Shot, Flame Waker, Consort, Twilight Whelp, Skulker, Fireguard Destroyer, Imp Gang Boss, Demon Wrath, bit of Lava Shock. And from the neutrals, we didn't have that many. We had bit of Corruptor, Grim Patron, Hungry Dragon, Technician, bit of Volcanic Drake, Thorazam was the big one, and some Chromagus and Apharium. So BRM had a decent hit rate, probably about 50-50 in terms of actual hit rate from constructed, which cards saw constructed play, which just didn't. Now, by comparison with Curse of Naxxramas, if we look at actual hit rate, we've got class cards are pretty universally considered to be bad in Naxxramas, which is actually hilarious if you look back on it, because you've got Web Spinner, Duplicate, Dark Cultist, Deathbite, Voidcaller. So just over half of the class cards made a very big impact. In fact, Cultist is a very powerful priest card and basically pulled them out of a ditch on their own. Deathbite is arguably, in fact, just probably is the best weapon in the game. And Voidcaller pretty much runs its own archetype. Web Spinner is a universal 1-drop and Hunter most of the time. And Duplicate does see some play from now and then. Then you move on to the neutrals, and oh boy, we've got some really heavy hitters in here. Loatheb, arguably the single most played legendary in the last year. I don't know what's played more right now, Thaddeus or Loatheb. And the reason I say that is because some control decks don't play Loatheb, but no aggro decks play Thaddeus. So I actually think Loatheb is still played more than Thaddeus, which is baffling considering how often you see that card, and it's definitely played more than Boom, I would say, Loatheb, because some players don't play Boom to avoid big game hunter targets. So I think Loatheb's played more than Boom, I think he's played more than Thaddeus, he's played more than Sylvanas. It's kind of insane how universally powerful Loatheb has been over the past year, and that was the main marquee legendary from the set. And we had KT, saw some decent amount of play, and the rest pretty trash. This is the worst part of Naxxramas, in my opinion, was these legendaries. But besides that, we had Echoing Ooze, has seen play. Shade sees a lot of play with Druid. Deathlord and Priest, Nerubian Egg, tons of play. Sludge Belcher, one of the single most defining taunts ever made. Haunted Creeper and Mad Scientist, arguably the best 2-drops ever created. Undertaker had to be nerfed into the ground because he was verging on the best 1-drop ever made. Unstable Ghoul was a bit of a sleeper, but is now seeing a ton of play because of Grim Patron. But that's more on Grim Patron's end as opposed to Unstable Ghouls. Spectral Knight was a bit overhyped, but did see a tiny amount. And Zombie Chow is one of the single most played 1-drops in mid-range and control decks. So just going from there, the sheer amount of impact that happened, BRM created Grim Patron Warrior, and it reinforced a few decks, but that's about it. In fact, if you look at it, there's a couple Dragon decks running around, but none of them have really broken the formula yet. I think there probably is a good Dragon deck out there somewhere, but no one's really figured out the correct build yet. I've got a feeling it might have something to do with just playing Corruptor and then late game Dragons and just skipping the early game stuff entirely. But besides that, it's just been strengthening other archetypes. So you got things like Nefarian and Control Warrior, Chromagus as a bit of a late game win condition because he does not have 7 attack, so no big game hunters for you. Volcanic went mid-range hunter, so the only real deck that came out of, and obviously Thorazan ends up in every control deck and is definitely the best card in the set by a very, very, very large margin. Grim Patron was the only thing that really made its own deck coming out of BRM, and the rest just kind of strengthened some already existing archetypes, and I think there's going to be a Dragon deck somewhere. So Flame ended up as a 3-drop in ramp decks, Druid of the Flame, and then Flame Waker. Tempo Mage ended up playing this thing, Quickshot ended up being universal in the already existing Hunter Shells. In fact, they just took out a couple cards and put in Quickshots. But not that many defining cards. The other defining card set was actually the Warlock ones, where Imp Gang Boss and kind of Demon Wrath, mostly Imp Gang Boss, kind of single-handedly reinforced the Demon Lock to work. Because it's arguably one of the best 3-drops in the game, and it makes that deck stable. So coming out of that, you kind of have Demon Lock became a thing, and Grim Patron Warrior has not quite supplanted, but it's definitely up there with Control Warrior, and depending on who you ask, one is better than the other, and it depends on the metagame. So 2 decks really emerged from BRM, and the rest were kind of strengthened or weakened depending on what was released. Now, Naxxramas pretty much threw the metagame out the window every single week. So what it did was, first it completely resurrected Zoo on its own. In week 1, actually, with Nerubian Egg and Haunted Creeper. Then that got stronger. Face Hunter, that had gone away a bit because Miracle Rogue was being less played because of Loatheb, I want to point out. Miracle Rogue died off because of Loatheb, largely, although it was still around. But to give you an idea, the Leroy nerf didn't come until, what, weeks and weeks and weeks. I think, when was the Leroy nerf? Was it actually GVG? I would not be surprised. Leroy and Gadgetzan were nerfed much, much later, but Loatheb pretty much single-handedly knocked Miracle Rogue off its position of rule, which it had been on for literally 6 months, in fact. For about 5 seasons in a row, the #1 deck was always Miracle Rogue. So Loatheb broke that down. Then Midrange Hunter came back because of Mad Scientist and Haunted Creeper. Face Hunter became more popular again. Zoo came back. Later on, Shade became a thing, although that took a while. Sludge Belcher ended up being everywhere and made some of these mid-rangey decks better again, since Miracle Rogue has been stamping on them for the last couple of months. And Undertaker pretty much single-handedly drove several decks. Death Rattle Priest became a thing. You had Zoo running it. Aggro Hunters running it. Not Face Hunters, Aggro Hunters. Like nowadays, we just have mid-range and Face. But when Undertaker was a thing for some of the newer players around that weren't around in Naxxramas days, because I know some people did start playing in GVG and in BRM even. But Undertaker pretty much single-handedly drove its own decks, and Turn 1 Undertaker was almost the litmus test of the format, and it was one of the reasons Paladin was terrible at the time, because you had to play Ironbeak Owl to not die to Undertaker on Turn 1, and I'm not even joking, you couldn't kill it. So Naxxramas pretty much threw the metagame out the window, and every single week over the 5? Was it 5? I think it was 4. Pretty much 4, because the Lost Wing only had 3 cards in it. Shade wasn't played that much. Echoing Ooze wasn't played that much at first, and KT didn't see play until way later. So for the first 4 weeks, the metagame completely changed every single week. Whereas in BRM, I don't know if anyone noticed, but the only times the metagame really changed were when Thorazan came out. And even then, that was more just every deck playing it. And also when Wing 4 came out, because that's when all the dragon stuff started happening. And Wing 5, arguably, because they got Corruptor. But even then, that was just reinforcing on Wing 4. So just from that perspective there, you can kind of tell Naxxramas did have a really, really big immediate impact. Over time, though, there's just more powerful cards than Nax. I think this may have been a design mistake, but while there are slightly more cards in BRM than Naxxramas, Naxxramas had some really borderline overpowered cards. In fact, some of them really were. Like, Undertaker was overpowered. You've got Mad Scientist, which is arguably the best 2-drop they've ever made, and is universally played in any class that can play secrets that are worth anything, so not Paladin. And besides that, you got things like Haunted Creeper, which is universally played, Sludge Belcher is universally played, Loatheb's universally played, still, even to this day, 2 sets afterwards, I want to point out. These are still being played everywhere. Whereas in BRM, the only cards that are really universally played is, well, I guess class cards, Imp Gang Boss. I'm not counting Shaman, because Shaman just doesn't exist right now. Flameraker seeing a ton. Consort is still in testing. Quick Shot, I guess. But in terms of neutrals, it's basically just Thorazan and then Grim Patron and Warrior. That's pretty much all of the really, really stupidly powerful cards from this set. Whereas Curse and Naxxramas, for better or for worse, had a way higher power curve in terms of cards, which at the time was actually, I think, in hindsight, the cards were too powerful. But at the time it was kind of necessary because the game was in a bit of a ditch because the metagame had been horrible for 6 months. I remember before Naxxramas came out, I actually was trying to start Versus Series up. And I didn't start Versus Series until Wing 1 or the week before of Naxxramas. And the reason for that was because I couldn't find anyone to come on it. I kept asking people and they're just like, nope, waiting for Nax, not playing in this metagame. And I'm not even joking. I did actually have Versus Series, the idea, like a month before it started, and I just could not find a player to come on because no one wanted to play in that metagame. It was fairly miserable. So when Nax came out, yes, the cards were very overpowered, but they did shake up the metagame enough, which was kind of required because we hadn't had a set release in a really long time. We'd been playing Classic for almost a year at that point. So in terms of constructed impact, I think Nax pretty much wins that hands down. It's not really that close. I mean, you can discuss it a lot, but it really wasn't that close. Now, going on to a second topic, which was Arena. Now, something of note in both Nax and BRM is because they are both adventures, there are a lot of commons and rares which, especially in Naxxramas, weren't really thought through on rarity, because the only things rarities affect in adventures is if it's legendary you can only play 1, and also golden dust increase. But there's something else which I think for BRM they realized, but for Naxxramas they kind of forgot about, which is that rarities affect Arena. Now, this is the kind of stuff I mean. So we got things like, at the epic slot, yeah, this worked out, that this was fine. But then at rare, we got some really random stuff, like Sludge Belcher at rare, which is arguably fine. But then we have Spectral Knight at common. Then we had Haunted Creeper and Mad Scientist at common, to the point when you actually pick secrets quite highly if you get a few Mad Scientists, which you can get. When Nax came out, because we didn't have GVG in the pool or BRM cards, you could easily get 3 or 4 Scientists. And if you had 2 or 3 secrets, you basically couldn't lose. Scientist was really disgusting. And for anyone who plays a lot of Arena, Mage is already good. You don't need to have 3 or 4 Mad Scientists and a couple of secrets. So, yeah, and before I forget, in terms of constructed impact, there was also a duplicate Mage that became a thing because of Nax, and that was suppressed a bit by Flare until that got nerfed. But anyway, so in terms of Arena, there were a couple issues with rarities. Spectral Knight became a bomb at common. We had some really weird interactions with Deathlord showing up way too much, in my opinion. It's not that it's good, it just shows up an obnoxious amount in a smaller card pool. Like nowadays, you have a bigger card pool, so it's not as obvious. But back then it was really irritating. Void Coil also showed up an absurd amount. They didn't have things like what's it called, Floating Watcher, because that was a GVG card. But you did have Dread Infernals. Dumping Dread Infernals on the board, they're both commons, and in a reduced card pool you did see these more. So things like Void Coiler and Deathspite were seen a bit too much in my opinion. Getting 5 Dark Cultists in Priest was just not fun. So as you can see, there were a couple things that just should have been rare that weren't. I think arguably Dark Cultist should have been rare, Scientist should have been rare, Deathlord probably should have been epic. There was only 2 epics in the entirety of Naxxramas. Was that true for BRM as well? Or did BRM have no epics? Had no epics. Okay, that made a bit more sense, because I remember looking at Naxxramas when it came out, where we just had these 2 random epics for no apparent reason. So, I mean, Echoing Ooze is arguably a bomb, but you need to build around it, and you don't really throw it enough to make it into a bomb, and Shade definitely is, so I'm glad it's epic there. But the rarities in general in Naxxramas were kind of last-minute expressions, which was weird. So there's a lot of stuff you don't want to see, like Gargoyle, which are at common, and a lot of stuff you don't want to see too much of when you're playing against like Spectral Knight and Mad Scientist, and even Zombie Chow. So Nax had a bit too much of an impact on Arena in kind of the wrong way. Now, BRM, I can thankfully say, was thought through a little bit better when addressing an arena game. Now, what do I mean by this? So, if we look at the commons, each class got a common and a rare. Now, if we just look at this, first of all, I really like this design in terms of getting 2 class cards instead of 1. Now, they did suffer for it because of the dragon synergies, which we'll get to in a bit after the arena thing. But in terms of actual how it felt getting class cards, this did give classes more of an identity, whereas Naxxramas, the problem was a lot of these class cards were very, very hit or miss. So we had some overpowered ones, and then some classes getting absolutely nothing in the case of Paladin and Rogue and Druid. So they got absolutely nothing, whereas in more recent sets they've been releasing a higher percentage of class cards, which I can definitely agree with. So anyway, if you look at the actual rarities, they are kind of geared towards Arena. Now what do I mean by this? So Druid of the Flame, stable 3-drop. It's powerful, but it's a stable 3-drop. 2/4s are pretty common, a 2/5 is above average, but it's a class card. Volcanic Lumber, however, is the rare because you don't want to play against a million trees with Taunt. Think about it. Ironbark Protector is a powerhouse common in some types of decks, depends on how much ramp you have and how much late game you have. A cheaper one is just obnoxious because you can just trade in Arena. The entire game is about trading most of the time. You just keep trading and you get your 7 or 6 mana, 7/8s with Taunt, and Big Game Hunter, if you get one you're lucky, but if you don't you're screwed half the time. And it blocks Force Tank maxes, it just doesn't die to them. So Volcanic Lumber is the rare, which makes sense. Hunter, Quick Shot, good removal, common. Core Rager, again, if you're in top deck mode, it can be fairly powerful, but besides that, it's a rare, but that's below average. But the main point, Quick Shot was chosen for common, they did think that through. Mage, again, removal at common, and Flame Waker, which can be overly obnoxious if you have a lot of spells, is rare because it's powerful. Paladin, Solemn Vigil, the more sort of carefully thought through effect when it comes to Arena as opposed to Dragon Consort. I mean, if this thing was common in Arena and you got multiple of them, I think you could just never lose. So they did really think about this. Even things like Gang Up being common is obnoxious because you keep seeing them. However, Dark Iron Skulker would be worse for the format if it was common. Resurrect again, things like that. Warlock, Demon Rod, they want to make AoEs for Warlock a little less common since you already have Hellfire at basic, whereas Imp Gang Boss stabilizes them out. Shaman, I do think was a bit weird that Fireguard Destroyer was the common. I think it should have been rare, and Lava Shock should have been common. And for Warrior, again, it's all fine. Now, in terms of neutral cards, the 2 rares, again, were thought through. The rares were Dragon Egg, which you don't want to see that often, and Grim Patron, which you don't want to see that often in most classes, but you also don't want a Mage to have a million of them, or a Warrior to have way too many Grim Patrons. So they made them rare, which makes sense. The rest of it, the Dragon Engine, is all common, so you can maybe draft a Dragon deck. So they did think this through in terms of Arena rarities, which is very much appreciated because they really didn't think it through in Naxxramas, and that kind of shows that the development team is getting better when it comes to thinking about covering all their bases. And I do think BRM was the more thought through set in terms of design when it comes to trying to be a bit more careful and trying to cater to limited formats. Limited in terms of the case of like drafting. So trying to think about Arena a little bit more than they did before with Adventures, because with GVG it made a bit more sense because it's also dust requirements and they thought it through a little bit better. So they have been getting better at thinking about multiple different formats within the game itself. So anyway, moving on to other kind of design aspects. Now, Naxxramas was focused around the death rattle mechanic. So this was supposed to be the basis, is that Adventures are focused around a more advanced application of a mechanic, whereas big sets are a bit easier to understand, but there's more cards, so it works that way. And I think I'm okay with them designing sets like that. So Naxxramas was focused around death rattle. Tons of stuff has death rattle, random battle cry and echoing ooze, but most stuff does have death rattle, and you had Baron Riven there with his multiple death rattle triggers, and all these have death rattle, even had a death rattle weapon. So a lot of stuff had death rattle, even things like Duplicate, where it's based around things dying, Avenge things dying, Poison Seeds kills things. The whole death and decay thing was a permeating aspect of Naxxramas, which makes sense because it's supposed to be an undead haven. Now, this did work. The reason it worked was because the death rattle synergies they had were Baron Riven there, which didn't see any play, but there was also Undertaker. The main reason this worked was because the death rattles were already good. They didn't need the synergies to make them good. Death rattle was already a mechanic that works in tandem with the game in general, and you can use it to dodge AoEs and things like that. It turned out Undertaker was just too powerful because the death rattles were very, very good, but when he got nerfed, it kind of worked out. So all these death rattles work out in the game normally because they don't rely on synergies to make the cards good. And by synergies, I mean things that say, if it has death rattle, you get a bonus. No, in this case, it's things like Mad Scientist and Haunted Creeper are good on their own, or in the case of Scientist, good if you have secrets in your deck. Nerubian Egg, give it attack, and then it's just powerful because its death rattle it has a job, and it works on its own without having to run, say, Undertaker to make it good. Now, Undertaker, when it was +1/+1, did make them better, but the point is the cards work on their own to some extent and work with other little synergies with base set cards at the time, like Flame Tongue Totem, or Direwolf Alpha, or Defender of Argus, things like that, and they work with death rattles. So death rattle was a very good mechanic to kind of go for, and in some cases it didn't really work out, but that was more of a case of power level problems as opposed to design issues. Most of the cards in Naxxramas were pretty well designed around the mechanic they were supposed to be revolving around. Like Dark Cultist is a fairly well designed priest card, the only problem being it was a bit too powerful, but death rattle can be put into the game more easily since it was already in base set. Not to the same extent, there were very few death rattle cards, but the point is it was already a mechanic and they knew how to design for it, and it worked. Now, Blackrock Mountain has two mechanics in it. First of all, trying to fit two mechanics in one set of 30 cards is really, really hard. The two mechanics were, if it dies, it costs less, if something dies, this costs less, and dragons. So, in terms of the death cards, they only released a couple. Well, three. It's 3 or 4. Yeah, 4. Volcanic Lumberer, Dragon Breath, Solemn Vigil, and Volcanic Drake. Now, the problem with this mechanic in general is that they didn't really test the cards very well. They were a bit too safe. So, Volcanic Lumberer is terrible. Dragon Breath is terrible. Solemn Vigil is a situational one-off in some Paladin decks that need draw. And yeah, I'm aware that when I did my video on Limited, I had 2 Vigils in there, but that was up to testing, and I probably would remove one immediately after one game. I just threw those deck lists together very, very quickly. So, the only card from that mechanic that actually made any impact whatsoever was Volcanic Drake. And that's largely because it's the only playable minion in Hunter with that mechanic. The other reason is because it's a dragon, but that feeds more into the other mechanic. The only deck that really plays it because of the text and not because of its dragon type with some other relevant ability is Hunter because of Unleash the Hounds. It just works with Unleash or with your trading. You can get it for 4 mana or less, and that's why that card is seeing a decent amount of play compared to the other ones with that mechanic. So based on the fact that they had two mechanics in one very small set, they didn't really have time, or they didn't have enough space in the set to test out these mechanics a little bit more. So that mechanic was a bit of a waste in my opinion. I think it should have just been a unique trait on Volcanic Drake and maybe on Solemn Vigil and just left the rest alone. Because keep in mind, Blizzard is designing for Arena and also for Standard. Now, the other mechanic in the set was if you're holding a dragon, do something, which actually was fairly okay. We had Twilight Whelp, Rend Blackhand, Corruptor, and Technician. The problem is that Dragon decks aren't very good. Why aren't they very good right now? The reason they aren't very good is not because the support isn't very good. The support's fine. You got Corruptor, Technician, that's good support. You have Twilight Whelp and Priest, that's pretty good support. The problem is that the dragons themselves are not powerful enough. So if we look at the dragons seeing play right now, we got Hunger Dragon, which is okay. We got Volcanic Drake sometimes, Azure Drake sometimes, Twilight Drake sometimes, Ysera, Chromagus, and Nefarian in a weird combination in some decks. Yeah, there's the problem. Now, the real issue with this is that the set was very small in terms of neutrals. Now, I did say it's a good idea to have 2 class cards for each class instead of 1, because in Curse of Naxxramas, these either had 0 impact or way too much impact on various classes. Like Deathbite impacted Warrior too much compared to the other classes that didn't get anything. So Avenge, Reincarnate, and Nubar, and Poison Seeds. So the difference was a bit too high. So I do like the idea of having 2 class cards. The problem with having 2 class cards is that what they should have done was had, instead of these die mechanics, what they should have done was had maybe a dragon synergy card for each class, try and get that working, have a dragon synergy card for each class, like Consort for example, and then maybe include Vigil and Volcanic Drake as something else to do with the dies mechanic. Like Paladin got a very balanced set of cards. But the problem is, because they didn't include dragon synergies for each class, there just aren't enough good dragons to make dragon decks function. And a lot of this is due to the fact that they tried to do a little bit too much with the class cards and not enough with the neutrals. So they used Dragon Egg, which I know is seeing a bit of play, but it was a bit of a wasted slot. So Dragon Egg was a bit of a wasted slot when they could have included another dragon. Draconoid Crusher was a bit of a wasted slot as well, because things with more than 7 attack just don't see play. So a few slots that could have been very good 2-of dragons in decks just were kind of wasted. The only common dragons that are actually, the only dragons that this set gave to dragon decks are, as I said, arguably Nefarian and Chromagus, but probably not both, and even then Ysera beats them out sometimes. And Volcanic Drake in some of these decks as well. Besides that, Hunger Dragon's okay, but he only works with Technician and not with Corruptor. Same with Sorcerer. You don't want to hold on to your 4-drop so you can get a bonus on your 5-drop. So there was a bit too much wasted potential in terms of the dragon mechanic, which has prevented it from having as much of an impact as, say, Mech did, because Mech was in a bigger format, which means almost every class had a Mech synergy, and eventually one of them hit home. It was Mage. So in this case, it's a case of there's only one or two possible dragon decks, and neither of them have been powerful enough to make an impact. So, in conclusion, if we kind of look at each of the categories, I will say that Naxxramas had a bigger impact on Constructed. I think BRM was better designed for Arena because it was more thought through. And I will say BRM was the better designed set in terms of being safe. What do I mean by that? So, safety is when you test out your cards so that they don't break the format in half, like Naxxramas did. But unfortunately, because of that, the Naxxramas cards, while they were a bit too powerful when they came out, they did get balanced a bit in the case of Undertaker, and they kind of melded with the metagame, and it's got to the point when if someone came to me and asked, like, what would you buy Naxxramas and BRM, just based on the cards, I would say Naxxramas. But there is one more thing to add into this discussion when it comes to design aspects, and that's the adventures themselves. Having played both adventures, BRM is the far better designed adventure. It just is. In terms of an actual adventure, so the campaign, you go, you fight bosses, BRM is way better designed. It's actually not close. First of all, they released it correctly. When Naxxramas was released, they weren't expecting the player flood, and it broke everything. Some people didn't even get their purchasing unlocked until GVG. So, yeah, and that was a purchase lock that should never have happened, and Naxxramas' launch was scarring. It was horrible. It was one of the worst launches I've ever seen, even by Blizzard standards. And BRM was released well. They didn't have that many hiccups. They had a couple issues with lag, but not too many. They didn't really have server downs as many, and it was actually well done. In terms of the adventure itself, the bosses were more interactive. You actually had to build, sometimes you had to build cool decks to beat the normal modes, whereas with Naxxramas you could blow through everything with one deck, not even close. You could just blow through everything. The fights weren't even memorable, most of them. And the heroics were mostly better designed in BRM. Couple exceptions. Certain fight where everything costs 1 mana, for example, which, yeah. BRM had a couple badly designed fights. Naxxramas, most of the heroics were badly designed. Let's just think about it. So we go back on some of them. Lotheb was okay, but it wasn't very good. Maexna was annoying. This was annoying. Add to the fact that the lag was ridiculous. It made some of the heroics, people who were trying to speedrun heroics had a miserable time in Naxxramas because the lag made certain fights like Maexna take 2.5 hours, and I'm not even joking. It did take me 2.5 hours to play through Maexna in one attempt. It was not hard. You just filled your deck with healing cards and fatigued her. The deck, it was not hard to beat. The heroic was very, very easy, but was ridiculously tedious. So, fights like that were just designed to be tedious were really, really annoying. And most of the heroics are very easy to beat, very easy to get past. And if you played your gimmick deck, they were just easy. And you didn't really have to think while playing, and a lot of them just became tedious. In the case of BRM, I haven't done a lot of the heroics, but I have talked to people who have done all of them. And they've been largely better designed from what I've heard. There have been a couple exceptions, but most of them have been fairly fun. There's been ones where you beat him because he plays Millhouse, and you just beat him with a ridiculous spell combo. I did do that, and it was fun. It did take a lot of attempts, but the point is it was amusing. So in terms of an adventure, I will actually say that BRM was better designed. The class challenges were a bit on par. I think class challenges were the best things from Naxxramas. A lot of them were very, very fun, like the 30 Web Spinner deck, and that was comparable to the 30 Unstable Portal deck. I think that was actually better, personally. The 30 Unstable Portal deck was more fun, had more RNG in it, and was just more fun in general. So I will say that BRM probably had slightly better class challenges, but not by much. One of my favorite class challenges ever was the one to get Duplicate, where you just played a deck with 1,000,000 secrets in it. That was one of my favorite class challenges out of all of them. Very, very fun to play. So class challenges in general were both very well designed, but in terms of actual bosses, I'll give it to BRM as being the better experience. So, final verdict. This is where it gets a bit weird because BRM at its core is a better designed set. They thought through their decisions more, they released it in a more smooth environment, it didn't break the format in half. But the problem with BRM is it was also a bit underwhelming in its impact. In fact, it had the least amount of constructed impact from any set. We've had 3 sets at this point, and BRM has had the least impact in terms of constructed by a reasonable margin. By quite a large margin, actually. GVG obviously had a fairly large impact by adding new decks and adding 2 previous decks, and it removed a couple decks from the format. Naxxramas had too much impact, actually. It just broke the game in half. However, that was actually necessary at the time because the metagame was that bad. But BRM just has not had that much impact. They made a couple decks, and that's about it. So, while I do think BRM was better designed, I want to say the actual better set in the end was Naxxramas, which is kind of weird to say that the less thought through adventure was actually the better one for the game in general. and will have a longer lasting impact. In fact, in the foreseeable future, I think 2 years from now, when we've got a whole bunch of new sets, I think only very, very few BRM cards will still be seeing play. Maybe 3 or 4, maybe Thaddeus and Grim Patron, and maybe, let's see, we've got Thaddeus, Grim Patron, probably Fireguard Destroyer, Imp Gang Boss, maybe 1 or 2 others. I think those will still be seeing play. And if they release more dragons in the future, maybe the dragon cards. Whereas Naxxramas, I think 2 years from now, we'll still see Cultist, Void Cooler, Deathbite, Spinner, couple duplicates every so often, Loatheb, Shade, probably, Nerubian Egg, Creeper, Scientist, Sludge Belcher. Like, they need to make some actual mistakes in design to dethrone some of these cards. And just based off that, I think if you only have the goal to buy one and you're fairly new to the game, buy Naxxramas. It's just a better set to have the cards from. And I think in terms of long-term impact from now, it will be the better remembered set. Because BRM was a bit underwhelming, and I did notice this when I was trying to do my top 5 overhyped, underhyped, and I realized that the most cards were given a kind of neutral response because they didn't really evoke any kind of polarizing opinion. Most of them were kind of like, it's okay, it's fine. I mean, Major Dormu made it onto one of my lists, for crying out loud. It was kind of weird that how hard it was to make those lists. I know it's a small set, but even then, I think while BRM was better designed, it just was the worst set. Out of the 3, actually, I will say it was the probably least impacting set and just worst set out of all 3 that have been released, and especially worse than Naxxramas, which is arguably the most impacting set we've had. So anyway, that's my incredibly drawn out comparison between Naxxramas and Blackrock Mountain, the 2 adventures we've had so far. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below, or if you want to disagree with me in long paragraphs, which I know some of you like doing. But for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.